Now we're going to do something different. We've been in Scripture all the way along, other than my story. It's not recorded there, fortunately. We're going to be talking now about the modern history of Israel. You know, this is important. The things that we're talking about are not just taking place in a book. You know, these things are literally taking place in the world around us today. We are living in an amazing time. You know, this time that God has regathered our people back to the land that he promised us, and on the way, again, to reconciling us to himself. But as I mentioned before, you know, you can figure that if God is doing something that is so powerful that it says that when he's hallowed in us and glorified in us before the eyes of the nations are going to know that he's Lord. You got to figure if that's what's happening, there's going to be some pushback. And that's all taking place in the geopolitical realities of our day. The issue as we go through this stuff is not an issue of if you're going to be pro or standing with what God is doing in the nation of Israel. That doesn't mean that you have to be against the Palestinians. God loves the Palestinians as much as he loves the Israelis. God loves Muslims as much as he loves Jews. And so it's not an issue of those things. But one of the things that's happening today is that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation about what's happening on the ground in Israel. And because people are concerned about justice, they're influenced by that. Then they develop opinions, and even political opinions, that oftentimes become very negative about Israel. Well, I'm not here to shape your political opinions, but it is important to me that however you think about what's happening there is based on truth and based on fact and not based on the kind of things that I was speaking about. So, but as we begin, I want to first know what you know. Now, we know Israel was called Israel in the Bible. So when was Israel renamed Palestine? By whom and why?
The Romans.
Yes. Okay. The Romans.
It was a take off their ancient enemy, the Philistines.
Why do you think they did that? If it was the Romans.
You're talking about when they were occupying Israel? The Romans were.
That, again, that's a Jewish way to answer a question with a question. We're not doing that. So, okay. And by the way, I'm not planning on answering these questions right now. Just so you know, we're going to answer them as we go through. But Chris says it's the Romans. What was the second thing you said?
The name comes from the Philistines,
right.
Palestine, and it was the Romans that were started calling that initially to basically bring a mockery and to remind them of their ancient enemy.
Okay. During what period of time did the Palestinians govern themselves in Palestine? I mean, you have a nation that's called Palestine. So when was it? What period of time were the Palestinians governing themselves there? Not sure. Okay. This is great because see, if you knew all the answers, then I might as well go home. So we don't need to do this. Okay. What territory did the League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, mandate for a Jewish homeland in 1920? The League of Nations was formed out of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. And they set aside a certain area of land for a Jewish homeland at that time. What area of land was that? There was a period of time when, again, we realized we needed a land, and somebody came up with the idea, well, we'll give you Uganda. Any idea? You don't know what area of land that was. Okay. Well, if you don't know that, you're not going to know this. I was going to ask you on what percentage of that original land mandate was the modern nation of Israel founded in 1948? Because you had this area set aside for a Jewish homeland, and then there was on a certain percentage of that. We won't use fractions, so if you want to guess, you can. I mean, you have a 1 in 100 chance of getting this right. What transpired that resulted in the reunification of Jerusalem and the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula coming under Israeli control? So before this time, Jerusalem was divided, but after this, again, Jerusalem was unified. The West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Sinai Peninsula came under Israeli control. When was that? What happened? Well, I'm glad you're here. Okay, this is good. And finally, why has the United Nations created 2 agencies to serve refugees? one for the Palestinians and the other for all the refugees in the world. How many of you knew that?
I did not know that. That's interesting.
Two, yeah, it's kind of interesting, and we'll talk about why in the world you would do that. But literally, one agency of the UN meets the needs or serves the needs of all of the refugees in the world, but they have a separate one just for the Palestinians.
Interesting.
Any ideas? Okay, so here's the other deal about what we're doing right now. I've done a lot of talking up to now. I'm going to be able to rest a little bit during this one. I'm going to make some comments and so on, but you are going to do a lot of reading, okay? And so it's going to be real important that you read clearly, et cetera. And then as you're reading this history, et cetera, I will make comments as we go. We're going to do some show and tell. We'll watch videos. One of the things that is important to me in this segment is that you guys get to hear some voices that you wouldn't normally hear. So you'll see that as we go. So let's get started. Would somebody read the first paragraph, please?
Since Canaan was conquered under Joshua's leadership in 1400 BC until today, there has never been a state in this geographic location that has not been Jewish, though throughout history this area has been conquered and controlled by many foreign powers, including the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabian Muslims, the Crusaders, and the Ottoman Turks.
Okay, so that answers one of our questions, actually. During what period of time did the Palestinians govern themselves in Palestine? And the answer is never. There's actually never been a nation state called Palestine. And we'll talk about how Israel got that name in a moment. But so though this area was conquered, as was read, by many different powers, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabian Muslims, Crusaders, and Ottoman Turks, there have only been three really nation states there. There was the first kingdom of Israel, the second kingdom of Israel, and now the modern nation of Israel. Okay, somebody go on and read the next paragraph, please.
Israel had been renamed Palestine by the Romans shortly after the time of Christ to affront the Jews in mocking remembrance of their ancient extinct enemies, the Philistines. The current day Palestinians are not descended from the Philistines.
And as Chris mentioned, so the name, Palestinians does come originally from the name of the Philistines. The Philistines, by the way, basically disappeared around 500 BC. They were assimilated into the Assyrians and also the Babylonians and the Persians at that point. But this is after Rome is now controlling Israel, and there was a temporarily successful revolt against Roman rule. It took place from 132 AD to 135 AD. The commander of the Israeli army at that point was a man named Bar Kokhba. And so again, the emperor, his name was Hadrian, of Rome at that point, was so angry, at Israel for that revolt that he said, you know what? I'm going to rub the Jews' noses in this defeat, and he decided to rename the country again after the Philistines. So initially he renamed it Syria Palestina, and afterward it became known as Palestine. Okay, would somebody go on, please?
From the early 16th century until the end of World War I, the entire Middle East was ruled by the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, let's take a look at the Ottoman Empire. Now, by the way, these maps are really cool. They are, they're graphic depictions here. They're not actual maps in the sense that, the borders of the countries are a little more squiggly than these borders, but they are in scale, okay? So this is the Ottoman Empire, again, prior to World War I. You can see here that we have modern-day Turkey is encompassed in that, modern-day Syria, modern-day Lebanon, this little strip along here next to the Mediterranean is Israel. This piece here would be part of Saudi Arabia today, as is this. This area would be Saudi Arabia today. That little thing there is Kuwait, and this is Iraq. And so that again consisted of the Ottoman Empire at that point. The Ottoman Empire was an Islamic caliphate, the same thing that ISIS is trying to introduce today. Okay, let's go on.
The Ottoman Turks aligned with Germany and lost World War I. As a result of this defeat, the League of Nations, predecessor to the UN, divided this region between mandates given to Britain and France. Under these mandates, the countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq were established for the Arabs, and the land, then known as Palestine, was set aside for the establishment of a Jewish state.
Okay, so understand, the world had to figure out what to do, after World War I. I mean, the Ottoman Empire, you didn't have individual nation states here. The Ottoman Empire, somebody had to decide what to do with this land after the Ottomans were defeated. They had aligned with Germany, I think, figuring that not only would they keep this territory, but gain more territory by doing that, but they lost the war. And so again, the League of Nations was formed under the Treaty of Versailles, and they decided what was to happen. So they divided it up into mandates. Mandates were temporary trusts set up to govern non-self-governing areas. It was never the intention that this would be colonialism, that they're going to govern these areas forever, and eventually they all became independent. So under these mandates, you had the nation of Syria that was set up again under the French mandate. You had Lebanon that was set up under the French mandate. The area that was set aside for a Jewish homeland set up under the British mandate, and Iraq also set up under the British mandate. Okay, let's continue.
The territory mandated to Great Britain by the League of Nations in 1920 for the establishment of a Jewish homeland encompassed all of the present-day Israel and all of what is known today as Jordan.
Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is the area, again, that the League of Nations set aside for a Jewish homeland. You can see, if you know the map of Israel at all, it's much, much larger than Israel is today. The borders of Israel today basically come down from here. This is the Golan Heights. They follow the Jordan River, which is the eastern border of Israel. This also cuts right through the middle of the Dead Sea and then goes diagonally down here to the Gulf of Aqaba in Israel's southernmost city, Eilat. This is actually even funny that the border, goes through the Dead Sea. There are interesting stories about that. Have any of you been to Israel? You know why the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea? Nothing can live there, and that's because the mineral, content is so large. And you can literally, you have to try very hard to drown in the Dead Sea because you just float. So you can basically sit on it, And what's happened is there have been tourists that come to Israel and they go out and they start floating around on the Dead Sea and they float to Jordan, And so literally, like, the Jordanian army has picked up some of them, and they have to transport them back to Israel. Okay, but again, as you see, this mandate was much, much larger than Israel is today. So let's see what happened. Somebody go on and read, please.
In response to the League of Nations plan to establish a Jewish homeland, the Arabs rioted, attacked the Jewish communities resident in Palestine, and used Britain's need for oil to persuade Britain to grant them 78% of the land allotted to the Jews by the League of Nations. In 1923, Britain created the Arab state, today known as Jordan, with this land.
So again, it's really interesting. Great Britain didn't do Israel any favors at this point. But as we read, the surrounding Arab nations were not glad about a modern nation of Israel and the Jews being reintroduced into what was primarily Muslim Middle East. And so, again, they fought against this plan, and many of them are still fighting against this plan, and they put pressure on Great Britain to give more land to them. So, and one of the reasons Great Britain did that is, one of the big jokes, about Israel is it took Moses 40 years to find the one nation in the Middle East without oil. And Great Britain, needed oil again to fuel their industry and their military and so on. And so, because of that, they created another nation state for the Middle East Arabs, originally called Transjordan and eventually known as Jordan. And we didn't stop carving things up there. So let's go on, read the next paragraph, please.
Britain eventually turned over the political furor regarding the creation of a Jewish state to the UN, who in 1947 partitioned the remaining 22% of the land originally reserved for a Jewish state into two states, one Jewish and one Palestinian Arab. This plan allocated to the Jews 10% of the land originally reserved for their homeland.
So that answered a few of our questions. What land was originally set aside by the League of Nations, again, for a Jewish homeland? And now we see that actually when Israel was founded, May 14th, 1948, it was on 10% of that land that had originally been supposedly given to them. So This is what the United Nations did. And I don't know what brilliant minds in the United Nations thought this was going to work. But this is the UN partition plan. So they decided, okay, we will give Israel this little area up here that surrounds the Sea of Galilee, which is right here and up into the Golan Heights. We'll also give Israel this little strip of land along the Mediterranean on the western border of Israel, which literally at its narrowest point was 9 miles wide. So it's totally indefensible. And then the main area that was given for, again, the Jewish state was this area, which was the Negev, and still is for that matter, the Negev desert, and in which nothing grew at that point. So that was supposed to be our state. And then, and you can see in some places these are not even contiguous, but you have this area, again, bordering Lebanon here, northern part of Israel to be part of the Palestinian state. This central part of Israel to be part of the Palestinian state. You had Samaria here, Judea here, which is really the heartland of biblical Israel. The reason there's a white circle around Jerusalem is that was supposed to be an international city, and then also gave to the Palestinians this little strip of land along the western part. This is the Gaza Strip right here, and also bordering Egypt. Okay, let's go on.
The Jews accepted this plan. The Arabs rejected it. When the modern nation of Israel was officially established on this 10% of land on May 14, 1948, the Egyptian army, quickly joined by the armies of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, immediately attacked it.
Okay, let's just stop and think about this a second. This is a little ridiculous. But why do you think, remember, the surrounding Arab nations and the Palestinians never accepted this, really up till this day. Why do you think the Jews accepted that?
They had nothing before.
They had nothing before, okay, or we, I should say, had nothing before. Okay, that's good. Beggars can't be choosers. I mean, what else? Any other ideas? Let me ask you, what happened just a few years before this? The Holocaust. I mean, literally, 6 million Jews, 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered in Europe. And so we were desperate, and we needed a land. And if this is going to be it, then we will take it. Understand this, that again, when Israel was declared its independence, May 14th, 1948, that was a Friday. How many of you know when the Shabbat starts for Jews?
Friday night.
Friday night. It's called Erev Shabbat. And although many of the founders of Israel, they weren't religious Jews, they didn't want to interfere with the Sabbath, so they actually had a ceremony. It was 4 p.m. in the afternoon on a Friday where they declared independence. I think it was a 32-minute ceremony. And so understand, after 2,000 years, we've got a land again. And there were Jews out dancing in the streets. And literally 4 hours later, Egypt was bombing Tel Aviv. And also, as we read here, in addition to Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq also attacked Israel. And literally, the nations looked at this and thought, you know what, Israel is going to be stillborn. Literally, now we're a nation, and boom, we're destroyed. But that's not what happened. Would you read on? Next paragraph.
Though poorly armed and outnumbered 4-1, Israel won their war of independence. Upon conclusion of an armistice in early 1949, Egypt and Jordan occupied most of the land allocated for a Palestinian state. Egypt and Gaza, and Jordan and Judea and Samaria, West Bank.
Okay, and we're going to talk about this more. And this was miraculous. And if you understand, the modern wars of Israel, I mean, this was really miraculous. And I'll just tell you a little bit about this. Under the British mandate, literally the British left the day before Israel declared our independence. And when the British were in control there, the Jews could not own arms. I mean, not even a handgun. Meanwhile, after, again, the United Nations decided upon this plan, the surrounding Arab nations who didn't want us there went out on the world's arms market. And think about this, all the surplus arms that would have been available after World War II, and armed themselves to the teeth. So you have the Jews sitting in Israel that can't even own a pistol, and you have the surrounding Arab nations arming themselves to the teeth and waiting for the day, again, that the British leave to destroy, this newborn nation. Actually, the only arms the Jews were able to have is they basically went to Czechoslovakia. They bought more or less small arms there, like rifles and that sort of thing, and they had to sneak them into Israel bolt by bolt in agricultural equipment and then assemble them in underground factories. So this is truly a miracle. Okay, this is what the map looked like after that war. Now remember, there wasn't a peace treaty after that war. There was just an armistice, which basically means this is where the army ends up when you stop fighting with each other. So what you had at that point is, again, this area, which is red here, was controlled by Israel. This area was controlled by Jordan at this point, Samaria and Judea, and this little area here was controlled by Egypt. And what you don't see here at this point is, at this point, Jerusalem was divided. Jordan was in control of the eastern side of Jerusalem, and the Jewish people were in control of the western side of Jerusalem. Okay, and this remained that way for how long? Would somebody read the next sentence?
During the 19 years that Egypt and Jordan occupied this territory, they made no effort to cede it to the Palestinians for the creation of a Palestinian state.
Now that can give us a little hint of something here, because many times, of course, the surrounding Arab nations say they're very concerned with the Palestinians' plight. And by the way, there's no question the Palestinians are suffering terribly, and we're going to talk about that more. Israel, is responsible for some of that suffering, but the majority of it, Israel is really not responsible for, and you'll see why. But understand this, that so basically the map's not identically the same, but very similar. That Jordan controlled most of this territory that had been ceded to the Palestinians for their state. Egypt, another portion of it. But during the 19 years that they controlled that, they never gave it to the Palestinians for the establishment of their state. And as far as I know, there was no great pressure, international pressure on them to do so.